Hello, it's April 3rd, 2016. I'm Don Thomason, and we're in the Senior Physiologist Lounge at the San Diego Convention Center at the annual meeting of the American Physiological Society. It's my pleasure and honor today to interview Dr. Leonard Rusty Johnson for the Living History project that the Society is doing. Dr. Johnson is a long-term member of the APS. He has been, he's one of the inaugural fellows of the APS when they started that program. And then he's been long associated with the University of Tennessee Health Science Center since he came there to assume the chair position in the Department of Physiology in 1989. Dr. Johnson's research is in the role of polyamines in programmed cell death, apoptosis of intestinal mucosa, and the role that the polyamines play in cell migration. Rusty, welcome to the Living History Project.
Well, thank you, Don, and thanks for that, introduction.
You're welcome. Rusty, let's start with your childhood. What sparked the interest in science?
I was born in Chicago, which was, a pretty non-natural place. Everything was really built up. And when I was 9, we moved to Munster, Indiana, which was very rural. And I'd always liked nature and the outdoors, and this gave me a chance to run around and do things. And I got so that I really did enjoy nature, and that sort of always made me interested in science, from biology, from the biological aspects, I guess. And I went away to college. I wasn't quite sure what I was interested in doing. I went to a wonderful liberal arts school called Wabash College in Crawfordsville, Indiana. And I started out just sort of vacillating as to what I wanted to do. And in the summertime, I'd go home and work in the steel mills nearby. That wasn't much fun, but it made a lot of money and helped pay expenses. I decided after my first year to major in zoology and minor in chemistry. But I had a lot of other interests. I ended up with minors in literature and philosophy as well, I guess. But the steel mill business wasn't making me any closer to a career. My dad was a steel worker, and about the only pressure I had was that he sort of manipulated things so I had jobs in the steel mills because he knew I'd go back to school then. And during my junior year, I saw a notice on a bulletin board in the science hall that the University of Michigan Physiology Department had NIH-sponsored summer fellowships. And I knew that one of the other senior students had gone up there the summer before, and I talked to him, and he really enjoyed it. So I applied, and had to go up for an interview. And the interview was pretty interesting. I met most of the faculty. Horace Davenport, who was chairman of the department and a member of the National Academy of Science, took me to lunch, and I really enjoyed it, and decided that physiology would be a lot of fun. I mean, it was zoology, and it sounded great. And when I left, excuse me, the head of the graduate program told me that Michigan had the best physiology department in the country, and if I decided to come there, they'd have a full fellowship for me. He said, you don't even have to bother to take the GRE exams if you don't want to. So, and I didn't, and I applied there. I only applied there, and so that sort of set the whole thing in motion.
Great. That's great. Did that experience then make your decision to work with Horace Davenport, who was chairman of physiology?
No, that came later. During the summer, I'd worked with Irving Fritz, and Irv was the head of the graduate program, and he was a metabolic endocrinologist. I worked on carnitine, and I thought I'd work with him. But you had to work with you had to work in 3 labs, 3 rotations before you chose your final rotation. And so I went through 2 rotations, and the third one, I said, well, Dr. Fritz, why don't I just work in your lab for the third one, and I can continue on with my thesis work. He says, no, I can't let you do that. He says, that's not what we do. You have to have a separate one.
Good.
And I said, well, I hadn't thought about it. Who should I work for? He said, why don't you ask Dr. Davenport? And I said, well, nobody works with Dr. Davenport. He had not had a graduate student.
Oh, really?
Davenport was very intimidating. He's 6'8", He was he was one of these people that didn't say hello in the hallways. I mean, he was all business. And I just said, well, nobody works with Dr. Davenport. And Fritz said, well, I think it'd be fun to see what would happen when you ask him. So I thanked him for that. And so I went up to, I knew his secretary pretty well, and I said, I need to talk to Dr. Davenport. And she says, well, knock on his door. He won't bite. You know, so I knocked on his door, and he said, yes, come on in. You know, oh, hi, Johnson. What do you want? You know, I said, well, sir, I was wondering if I could work in your lab this summer. And he could put it down. He goes, oh, like that. You know, well, he says, as a member of this faculty, I guess it's my duty to have a student once in a while. And he said, yes, come back and see me tomorrow. Well, I went out of there about as fast as I could. You know? And the next morning, here's a stack of books on my Carroll desk, you know, from him. You know, read these, H.W.D., Horace Willard Davenport, you know. And that started the relationship.
Great.
And I worked with him that summer. And actually, his demeanor was totally different from what I imagined it to be. He would come down at noon hour and cook some pork and beans or soup on a Bunsen burner and eat his lunch and regale me with stories of the history of physiology and the history of science. He had a photographic memory, and he had all this stuff in his head. He was a pretty imposing guy. And I was supposed to look at damaged mucosa, which he was working on the gastric mucosal barrier. And the idea was for me to see what happened, whether histamine was released or not. Well, we didn't know how to measure histamine. So he and I got on an airplane in Detroit and flew to the Mayo Clinic, and he spent 2 days with his buddy Charlie Coden. I spent 2 days with Charlie's technician, Joe something or other, learning how to measure histamine. And that was my first flight, my first commercial flight.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that was the first time I'd been I'd flown into the Canadian bush in a bush pilot, with a bush pilot, but never on a commercial flight before. And at the end of the summer, I had a paper, which was funny. It was it was pretty straightforward, simple paper. And we sent it to the Society for Experimental Biology and Medicine. And about 2-3 weeks later, I got back, I think, saying it had been accepted, without any changes. And I went running to Davenport. And he said, yeah. He said, I was afraid that might happen. I'll never forget that. But when I wrote it, the only correction he made was to strike his name off the paper. And
so it was a single author paper?
Yeah, I was the only author. And I thought, this must really be horrible if he doesn't want his name on it. But he just told me, he said, no, he said, it's your work. He said, I don't know. Anyway, so that was the start. And we were on a trimester system. We had a month off then. And my wife and I went on a vacation. And I started thinking, I said, this project was pretty good, and I could see how it would develop into a thesis, and I liked Davenport. So when I got back, I went to his office and I said, Dr. Davenport, I sort of would like to continue doing this. He said, but the problem is that I'd kind of had an understanding with Dr. Fritz to work with him. And he says, don't worry about that. He says, after all, I am the chairman of the department. And so that's how it started.
Yeah. That's great. And then from there, you went to do a postdoc at UCLA and with Martin Grossman.
Yeah, I really lucked out. I mean, Davenport was a fabulous mentor, and he was an influential person, past president of the Physiological Society, and knew everybody. And he was obviously a brilliant man. And I'll never forget, he came down one day to the lab, and he said, Rusty, he called me Rusty by now instead of Johnson. He said, you're about ready to finish. He said, you need to get a postdoc. Postdoctoral fellowship, yes, sir. And he said, I think there's 3 choices. He says, there's Börje Uvnäs in Sweden. Uvnäs was the guy that showed that the vagus had stimulated the release of gastrin. And I still hadn't been out of the Middle West except to go to Atlantic City for Federation meetings. And I thought, yeah, Sweden would be nice. And then he said, Börje's kind of old. He's getting long in the tooth. I went, well, yes, sir. He said, there's Rod Gregory, and I knew Professor Gregory. He was chairman of physiology at Liverpool, and he's the guy that isolated gastrin and synthesized it. Well, he and Kenner synthesized it. And then he said, Rod's more of a chemist. He said, I like Rod. He says, but I think you really need a good physiologist. Now, he says, Mort Grossman out at UCLA is the best GI physiologist in the world. I said, well, it sounds like I'm going to California. He said,
Yeah.
good choice. So that's what it was. He set it up. You know, in the next Federation meeting, I met with Grossman, and we wrote a NIH postdoctoral fellowship, which I got, and I moved out there in 1967, I guess.
And the Federation meetings being the what we now call experimental biology.
EB, that's right. Yeah, these were in Atlantic City.
Yeah, good, good.
They were a bit different from now.
Yeah. So you were also an instructor there on the
At
faculty.
UCLA, yeah, I lectured to the dental students.
Okay. So
And taught some labs. Not
Okay.
much, but some.
how large was the department
At
at
UC
UCLA?
You know, I didn't have much to do with the department. Grossman's labs were in the VA hospital. And I didn't have anything to do with the department other than that Mort, set up these lectures for me, or the labs that I did.
Yeah.
So I didn't really interact with it at all.
Okay.
We,
Yeah.
Every day, or 6 days a week, we did, research in the VA.
Yeah. How was the research at the VA at that time? It's a
Well,
large
it was-
VA there.
It was
in
different.
Los Angeles.
It was all chronic animals. The whole thing was blood and guts, literally, GI physiology.
Yeah.
I was fortunate in that when I went there, the gastrointestinal hormones were being isolated and their structures determined and even synthesized in some cases. And all the chemists that were doing this sent everything to Grossman
Yeah.
to figure out the physiology because he was the best. And I was only there a year and a half and I wrote 27 papers.
Wow.
And some of them are classics because we described the effects of the gastrointestinal hormones. We had, the first day I came there, we went up to the animal quarters and he showed me how to make Heidenhain pouch and gastric fistula dogs. And the next day, he watched while I made one, and the third day I had to do it by myself. And I had, each set of dogs, there were 4 animals in each group. And I had a Monday, Wednesday, Friday group and a Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday group. And we, depending on what we wanted to measure, you had Heidenhain pouches, which were vaguely denervated, so they're only affected through the blood.
Right.
You had Pavlov pouches, which were vaguely innervated. You had pancreatic fistulas, so we could study pancreatic secretion, and so on and so forth. And I ran just did a lot of experiments, and, did a lot of neat stuff. It was fun.
Yeah.
And the other thing, though, that you talked about what my research interests were. My original research interests were really just the regulation of the growth of the mucosa of the stomach and the intestine. And I had gotten an idea while I was in Ann Arbor, still at Michigan, my last year, that just from reading the literature, that gastrin had to be a trophic hormone. And I did one experiment before I left Ann Arbor, a protein synthesis experiment, and showed that gastrin did stimulate protein synthesis. And after I got set up with my dogs, and I had inherited a technician finally after about 6 months in Los Angeles, I went to Mort and I said, I have this idea, and I told him all about it. And he said, gee, we're not set up to do that kind of biochemistry. But he said, I know who is, and let me see if I can't get you to, into that lab for, say, a day a week. So I ended up going on Fridays out into the valley and worked in the laboratory of Dr. Dorothea Ories, who was doing histamine, ornithine decarboxylase, and that sort of stuff, but she had a biochemistry lab. And did some experiments with DNA synthesis and indeed showed that gastrin was a trophic hormone. And then when I left Mort's lab into my first job, my first grant was the effect of gastrin and other factors on the growth of the gastrointestinal mucosa. I didn't write a grant on anything I was trained to do.
Yeah.
And so that was the...
Well, and that work ended up with a paper in 1976, I think it was, in gastroenterology about the trophic effects of the hormones. And that was a new view of the...
Right. Yep. Actually, the first paper was 1969, I think. It was a paper I did in Dorothea's lab, Dorothea Ories' lab. And that was, that was my first grant, and it was my last grant. I kept that grant for 50 years. Well, 46 years.
Yeah, close enough.
Yeah, 46 years.
Great.
And, but that was the, And then I got into the polymeans stuff that you talked about, because polymeans were known to be necessary for growth, so that was
Right.
still part of that grant.
Right.
But the grant originally was gastrin and GI hormones.
The same thing.
Yeah,
Yeah. So then you went to Oklahoma, the medical school in Oklahoma.
I did. And again, you know, I got on this track with actually what turned out to be three terrific mentors, the third being Gene Jacobson. Eugene D. Jacobson was chairman at Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And Gene had been a fellow with Mort as well. Gene was out of the Army, had done research in the Army, came out of the Army as a captain, and then went to Grossman as a fellow, an older person, an older fellow, and did some work with him for several years, and then became chairman at Oklahoma. And of course, then Mort told him about me, and I looked at, I think I had 4 or 5 offers to go to other places, but I looked around, and it was interesting. You know, Oklahoma was certainly not the most, well, it wasn't the biggest name of the medical schools I looked at.
Right.
But it had a lot of things going for it, and not the least of which was Jacobson, whom I really liked. I thought he was terrific. And the other thing about it was, if I went there, I was going to be the GI physiologist in the school, not, you know, somebody's, you know, second or whatever. You know, it was pretty odd. And I've always been and Mort wanted me to stay and run his lab, you know, and which was tempting, but I did not like Los Angeles. And
really?
I didn't want to stay, you know, I wanted to go off on my own.
Yeah.
And so I ended up going to Oklahoma, and it was a good decision. I set up my lab, got my grant, and, you know, started off.
Yeah.
Didn't stay there very long.
No.
And, you know, Grossman or Jacobson left after about 2.5 years to go become the first chairman of the physiology department in Houston, the new University of Texas Medical School, where you did some postdoctoral work. And he wanted me to go with him. Well, I, again, looked around and had a few other offers, and finally, after going down there, I really liked the idea of a brand new medical school.
Yeah.
I thought the dean was superb. That was Chevis McCord Smythe, who was a character in his own right. But he interviewed me, and I remember him asking me, he said, you know, you're 30 years old, you're going to come down here as a full professor. What are you going to do as an encore? And I said, I think maybe I'll be a dean. And he laughed. And he and I became really great buddies. We hunted and fished together for 17 years, I guess.
Great. And that was a great setting with, you know, Baylor, the Texas Medical Center
Yeah.
coming up.
But that was, you know, and you know, Jacobson, again, was another terrific mentor. I mean, I was really lucky. I had these 3 terrific mentors, you know, Davenport and Grossman and Jacobson. And I learned a lot from Gene. We became very close friends. And unfortunately, he didn't stay in Texas, but I don't know, 5 or 6 years maybe. And he went off to be dean at Cincinnati. And but that was the time that I really concentrated on my research. You know, I really got a second NIH grant, which I also kept until last year, and had lots of postdocs, and, you know, really hit the research really hard.
Yeah.
And did all the other stuff that you do, you know, all the meetings and the symposia and the work in the society and all that sort of thing.
Yeah. And that was a very good department.
It was a good department. Gene had built the department along the gastrointestinal physiology lines, and there were some really good people there, but he also had a lot of people who weren't GI people. When we started out, you know, in order to make an impact, his idea was to just hire some GI folks, and then as things got going, hire more. And so the first people were myself, Bill Weems, and Norm Weisbrot, and Gil Castro, as you well know. And then he spread out and got Frank Booth, whom you worked with, and lots of other folks.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
And so then you assumed the chairmanship at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center in the physiology department, taking a strong department already and building it up even stronger with a lot of new hires, myself included.
Well, you were the first hire. You were the first faculty member I hired after I moved to Tennessee.
Well, I gotta thank you for that.
Well, hopefully. But No, my research went well. I never had any problems getting grants, and I had a lot of opportunities to look at chairs.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't want to become a chairman until I had really felt that I was ready for the job or mature enough for it, or whatever you want to say. And I think what it takes is a feeling that you're willing to put your own research in, sort of not off to the side, but it's not any longer your primary activity, because now you're going to have to be responsible for supporting other faculty,
Right.
younger faculty. So I had realized by the time I was, mid-40s, I wasn't going to win the Nobel Prize. So I figured that, this was time to become chairman.
Mm-hmm.
And started looking around. It was funny, Jim Schaefer, who, was a president of the society, he and I went through graduate school together and remained buddies, and we were in the same boat. And we took turns going to places, looking at chairs, and would call each other on the phone and decide whether it was worth to go or not.
Cross
So
paths in the
it was
airports.
funny. But the Memphis situation was a good one. I enjoy the outdoors, like hunt and fish and all that sort of thing. And it was a place that I could do that.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't the primary cause, but it was a place I would enjoy living, I thought, other than New York City or Philadelphia, which were some of the other offers.
Mm-hmm.
And the department was good, as you said. It was a good department. I think it ranked like 34th in terms of funding of physiology departments at that time. And it had a lot of space. I had a lot of slots to fill, faculty positions to fill, and I had the resources to do that.
Yeah.
And I liked the dean a whole lot, and I liked the chancellor a lot.
Yeah.
Bob Summit was the dean, and Jim Hunt was the chancellor, and they were both extremely supportive. So it was a good situation. It was the best situation that I had seen, and one that I thought would be a lot of fun. So in 1989, I moved to Tennessee.
Yeah. Okay.
And,
While you were in Texas, you were acting chair for a couple of stints there.
Yeah.
Did that prepare you at all for being chair of a physiology department?
Not really. An acting chairman doesn't do much but act. I think. I wasn't interim chairman. There's a difference.
There is. Yeah.
And I didn't hire faculty. I didn't, so it was. I was a placeholder, I think, at those, and they weren't for very long. And I think it was, it was a good experience. It got me into the chairman's meetings with deans and all that sort of thing. So I sort of got an idea of how medical schools were run anyway, how that one was. And but I think becoming chairman was an education in its own. Yeah.
Were there surprises that you wished you'd known beforehand?
Oh, not really. I started getting phone calls. It became obvious that there were two factions in the department.
Okay.
One was in favor of the person who had been the acting chairman and then had been removed for cause from that position. And then the other faction were those that didn't like him very much.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I got there, on the first faculty meeting, that's before you even got there, I said that, look, I put up with just about anything except people who are actively trying to cause trouble. And I said, as far as I'm concerned, history starts today.
Well,
And
good.
never had any problems.
Yeah. Words to the wise.
But other than that, I think that was it.
Okay. And then moving up in the university, you became Vice Chancellor for Research at the Health Science Center, University of Tennessee Health Science Center.
I had a deal, understanding with Dean Summit when I took the job, and I said, I don't want to be in this position as chairman unless you want me to be, and unless I want to be. So I said, after 5 years, if we both agree on that, I'll stay for another 5 years, and then I think 10 years is long enough.
Mm-hmm. It turned into 17 years.
Yeah, no, if I was 15.
15.
But Bob unfortunately died during that second 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the new dean, Hank Herod, I told him of this. He looked at me and he said, we're not doing that. He said, this physiology is the best basic science department we've got. I said, I can't afford to hire another chairman. You have to stay. I told him I'd stay for 5 more years,
Okay.
and that's what I did.
Yeah.
I left after that 5 years.
Yeah.
And it was a time to leave. You know, I had used up all my faculty positions. I had used up most of the resources that I had to hire faculty.
Mm-hmm.
It filled all the labs. And, you know, the only thing, you know, the department could do is just maintain a steady course, and that's almost impossible to do without going downhill.
Yeah.
So I said, you know, that 15 years is long enough. They need a new chairman who's going to have some more chits to spend and develop, you know, continue to develop the department.
Yeah.
And I had fully intended to go back to the lab and just do research. But then we had a new chancellor who came in, and I liked him a lot. And Bill Owen was his name. And he taught me into becoming vice chancellor for research for the Health Science Center. And I thought that would be fun. And I liked, like I say, I liked Dr. Owen. And it was fun, but he didn't stay very long either. He was too good for the place, in my opinion.
Yeah.
He didn't last but about 3 years.
Yeah.
And we did some reasonably good things. We got, I think there were a lot of problems with, I think animal care.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of I'm sort of blanking on the word I'm trying to find. Issues with faculty, with safety, laboratory
Yes.
safety, and all this sort of thing. We got all that straightened out. That was good. Got some money that we spent a little bit of money in places that needed to be spent. But I really didn't have a lot of resources.
Right.
And again, it was a fun thing for a while. And after he left, and we had some interim chancellors who weren't very good. It wasn't fun, and I decided that it was time to go back to the lab. And I had about 4 or 5 years left, and then, as you know, I retired totally at the end of this past year.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was it.
And that was a challenging time. Not that all times aren't challenging for research, but there were new federal regulations coming down, and funding wasn't at the levels that it had been previously.
No, there were a lot of I think a lot of changes over those 50 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
Well, certainly your work with the polymeans and the mucosal growth and trophic factors and so on is seminal. I mean, everybody cites that literature. I think you're...
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. I've always tried to not to start an area of my own or get into a very new area.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the gastrin thing was totally new at that time. No one had any idea that gastrointestinal hormones did anything other than stimulate secretion and motility. And they weren't supposed to have any metabolic effects. So that was new. And the polymeans, no one had done any work with polymeans in GI tissues.
Yeah.
I knew that they were important in growth. I mean, that had been known for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
So that turned out to be a good thing. And I was fortunate. I've had some really strong postdocs. Jen-Ying Wang was in the lab, and he and I did some stuff on damage, and that got us into the migration area with polymeans.
Okay.
And so it was a good run. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah. Well, yeah. We all have to thank you for all that body of literature. I think I checked your H index, and it's like 267
I'm
or
not
something
even sure
like
what
that.
that is.
That's
the number? Or?
Yeah, that's the citations versus number of publications, and
is that right?
That's up there. Yeah.
I have no idea. But it's been fun. I've done a lot of things, traveled the world on my science, which I never expected to do.
Yeah, you received an honorary doctorate from in Poland.
Yeah, from Krakow. And that was quite an experience. That's the Jagiellonian University and Copernicus Medical School. Mm-hmm. The reception for that was held in Copernicus's laboratory with all of his equipment around.
Wow.
Yeah, that was pretty special.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah.
That is.
Yeah.
So, over your time with the APS, meetings have changed. We went from the Federation to now experimental biology.
Yeah.
How do you see the difference?
Well, I'll never forget my first meeting. You know, I mean, it was in Atlantic City, and this is the first time I'd really been out of the Middle West.
Mm-hmm.
And it was Jim Schaefer and I and Gene Overholt, who was a resident in medicine. He was a gastroenterologist. He was working in Davenport's lab. And the three of us had a room together in the old Ambassador Hotel. And it was a big room. It was odd shaped and everything like that. And the junior faculty from the physiology department at Michigan got wind of it, and they decided that was going to be the party room. And so they brought their booze, and you know, it was quite a meeting. But you know, the meetings there were different. All the hotels were lined up on the boardwalk.
Mm-hmm.
Have you been to one there?
No, I haven't.
All right. Well, all the hotels were on the boardwalk, and it was about a mile, or maybe a good half mile anyway, of hotels. So and you had to go back and forth between the meeting rooms, you know. So you passed and saw everybody on the boardwalk.
Yeah.
So it was hard to get someplace without stopping and having a conversation, which was terrific.
Yeah.
And the other thing about that meeting that I think is unfortunate today is there were no posters. Everybody gave an oral presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the only people giving oral presentations are established scientists almost, or at least high-ranking, you know, postdocs or whatever. But then, I mean, you had to be on your toes. You had to give your oral presentation and be prepared to answer questions from everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, I never gave a poster when I was a graduate student or a postdoc.
All oral.
There were no posters.
Yeah.
Everything was oral.
How large was the meeting? Do you recall?
I think it was 20,000.
Really?
It was a big
Okay.
meeting. But it was all the societies.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like it is now.
Yeah.
I don't know, how large is this meeting now?
I don't know. I didn't check the numbers.
But it was a big meeting.
Yeah.
You know, the convention center was filled with exhibits, and of course, when you're a graduate student, that exhibits, all that equipment was, you know, like
Yeah.
Christmas
Salivate.
morning, you know.
Yeah.
That was fun. And so I think the students, you know, today's course sort of suffer a little bit from not having the real chances to present their stuff in a pretty tough environment like that.
Yeah.
I understand that we just don't have room for it.
Right. But it does hone those skills.
But I used to, you know, when I addressed the graduate students, when I was chairman, I used to tell them that, you know, one of the things you've got to do is learn to, you know, talk on your feet.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to be able to sell yourself on your feet.
Yeah.
You know, you've got to be able to do that. You've got to be able to write. You know, and those of you that aren't speaking English as a foreign language, you know, get on the ball and start, or speaking it as a foreign language, get on the ball and learn it, you know.
Yeah.
Well, that's, you know how much that advice has been taken.
Yeah. Well, communication is key.
It really is.
Yeah.
And, but the APS itself was quite a great experience for me. You know, I was always more interested in research and the publications than I was other aspects of the APS. And so I, you know, got on the editorial board of the American Journal of Physiology. There was only one at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And then became an associate editor. And then when they split up the journals, I was the founding editor of AJP, GI and Liver Journal. And you know, from then I ended up being put on the publication committee and ended up chairing it for 6 years. Yeah. That was, I think, right after I moved. I'd have to look at my CV, but I think that was right after I moved to Memphis. And that was a lot of fun. It was a big job, but it was a lot of fun because you know, I really met a lot of other people in the society, learned how the society worked, maybe a member of the finance committee because publications supplied all the finances.
Yeah, right.
So I had to be on the finance committee, and I also may be a member of council. So I was on the council for those 6 years as well as the finance committee, and it was spent a lot of time in Bethesda.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and this was the time to you know, you're on study section,
Right.
and doing all this other stuff, and it was a you know, those were the sort of halcyon years, I guess, and I enjoyed it all,
Yeah.
and I really enjoyed the society.
Great.
Yeah.
Do you feel that some of the things you've done have really influenced the direction that the society's taken?
We did some good things with the publication committee. I think we did. Again, you know, one of the things that we did, we put it on a firm financial basis. I say we. Brenda Rauner was running the publications from the as a member of the society, as an employee of the society. She was the executive director. I don't remember what her title was. But I basically had to make all the decisions, which is an interesting situation. But the same with the president, he makes all the decisions. But you know, but anyhow, and we decided that each of the editors had to be responsible for his budget, and before that they weren't. And we got a number. I think it was $200 per submitted manuscript that we thought ought to be budgeted. And we worked that all out, saying, you know, how much each editor's office was spending and how many. And we found out that it ran from about $150 a manuscript in some offices to $600 a manuscript in others.
Wow.
And by the time after 3 years or so, it was pretty much down to 190 or 200 in everybody's office. And that was good.
Yeah.
And I introduced the idea that editors ought to be paid too. And I think that's still being done. I don't really know how that works.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
But we did that. We got manuscript handling fees, which probably wasn't the most membership really like that, but it was necessary.
It was necessary to do that.
And then the other thing that happened at that time too, of course, was that all the journals were split off. You know, we had all of a sudden where there was one journal, we now had 7 or 8.
Right.
In addition to Journal of Applied Physiology and the other ones.
Yeah.
And I was in charge of hiring all the editors, and that was a job. I
bet it
basically
was.
put together a search committee for each editorship.
Yeah.
And I've got some good editors. I hired the first female editor for one of the journals that was AJP Cell. I took a lot of flack for that because there was a pretty important person who also applied for the job, whom I knew just wanted to put it on his CV and not do much work. But Kim Barrett did a lot of work, and she became a terrific editor.
Great. Yeah.
I think she also became chairman of the publications committee later and president of the society. So I think I look back on that job as one where I did contribute to the society, and I think it was certainly fun for me. And that's an interesting job because you're also head of the International Union of Physiological Sciences, their journal, and so it was. I learned a lot. Got to do a lot of things.
Well, and you met a lot of people. So
met a lot of people. Traveled a lot.
Yeah. So that's certainly helped your career, no doubt.
Well, yeah.
We encourage
sure
people to get involved in activities of the society.
By that time, it was kind of, things were relatively fixed, I think.
Okay. But, what would you tell somebody just starting out? That seminal piece of advice.
I don't know. I've thought about that question. I read these questions, as you know, probably realize. And that's a tough question. Medical science today is not what it was when I went into the field. You can tell that just by looking at the number of authors on papers.
Yeah.
When I started out, I had some single author papers. Most of my papers had one fellow on them, a technician, maybe 2 or 3 total people. Now you look 20, 30, sometimes there's 50 or 60 authors. So what that tells me is that an individual investigator cannot really hope to master all the techniques that are necessary to do the work today. So that means you really have to know a lot of people. At least I would say that. Yeah. It's no wonder that, I spent 1.5 years as a postdoc. It's no wonder that some people spend 6 or 7 or 8 years as postdocs trying to learn techniques. And again, I think that to be successful, you've got to have the ideas. And I think that, as you well know, that there are a lot of people who end up as career postdoctoral fellows. They may not be called that, but they have other titles, non-tenure track instructors and so on. But you've got to have the ideas, and you've got to be able to then figure out how to do the experiments and either do them yourself or find people that know how to do them and talk them into working with you, which is what's done. Science is different today from what it was when I started. I enjoy really all my science was what I'd call hypothesis-driven.
Mm-hmm.
And now, I mean, still there's plenty of hypothesis-driven science, but there's also a tremendous amount of data mining.
Right.
You get these huge, reams of data, and let's look at this and see if there's anything interesting. Well, that's not me.
Discovery science.
I don't want to do that. I didn't want to do that, and I wouldn't want to do it. And so I think that I don't think it's as much fun today as it was when I started. That's I think it could be. Of course, I don't have all those techniques at my disposal either. I'm not a technician.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think if I knew more about molecular genetics and so on and so forth, I'd probably be more enthusiastic about the situation today. But as you say, the funding situation is certainly more difficult.
Yeah.
And there are a lot more people looking for jobs than there were back then.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the last person that I hired in the department as chairman. I had 205 applications for that one position.
Wow.
The average age of the people applying, now this is for, assistant professorship, was 37. And I hired the youngest person that applied. And he now has 3 grants, so it worked out.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you've always been good at choosing faculty who are successful and mentoring them in the way to be successful.
I think we chose well. I didn't do it all myself. I always had a search committee, but I chaired it. I think it was my responsibility as chairman to, be responsible for whoever it was the department hired. Mm-hmm. And we did hire really good faculty. Yeah. And I had the resources because, we had a situation whereby as the department got more grants, I got more money to work with, and the people in the department were very good at getting grants. Mm-hmm. So the department was wealthy, and I think we made good use of it in supporting the faculty.
Well, and it took good leadership. There's no question about that.
Thanks for that. Yeah. But I mean, yeah, I enjoyed that. I think of all the things that I've done, that building that department probably was the most gratifying. Certainly one of the most gratifying. Yeah. Yeah. It still is a good department. Current chairman Gabor Tigge's done a great job, I think, of maintaining it and increasing its abilities.
Great.
So.
Well, Rusty, thank you very much for sharing with us.
Right.
Anything else you'd like to add?
Oh, I don't think so. This has been fun. Again, I know this is the Physiological Society doing this, and I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this, I guess they call it the living history.
Living history, yes.
Somebody asked me if I was going to be a living legend. I told them I don't think so. So, I'm grateful to the society for all the what I've been able to do, within it, and what that has meant to me in my career.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.